So I'm Neiloufar family. I'm a postdoc at the University of Kaiserslautern. But first, I'd like to acknowledge some of my collaborators on this. So this study was done in close collaboration with David Vinson and Gabriella Vigliocco at the University College London, and would not have been possible without David Nutt and his wonderful team at Imperial College, namely Robin Carrett-Harris, Mendel Kalin, and Mark Bolstridge. So before we dive into talking about psychedelics and language, it's worth asking the question, why look at language at all? So language is something that makes us uniquely human. It's something we're not going to find in any other species, as far as we know. And there's always a wise guy who says that it's futile to look at rats when you're looking at the psychedelic experience, because rats don't have the psychedelic experience. But language is another thing that we can't go looking for in other species. And furthermore, looking at the structure of language can shed light on how the mind is organized, how the mind works. So bringing psychedelics into the mix, looking at the structure of language in the psychedelic experience can tell us a little bit about the psychedelic experience. So I know I'm not alone in this room to want to somehow quantify or qualify the psychedelic experience, and language can just be one of those tools that we use to do that. But taking this from the flip side, so taking the exact opposite perspective, bringing psychedelics in as a neurochemical tool and looking at alterations in language and mapping that onto alterations in neurochemistry, we can learn something about the neural underpinnings of language processing and how it's stored in the brain. So the reason why we can do this is because of the particular psychopharmacology of psychedelics. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but this study is going to be about lysergic acid diethylamide. So LSD has, the LSD molecule has high structural resemblance to one of our endogenous neurotransmitters, serotonin. And serotonin plays a role in regulating mood, associative learning, memory, amongst other things. And due partly to its structural similarity to serotonin, LSD activates certain neural pathways, certain serotonin receptors in the brain. So again, looking at alterations that LSD causes in neurochemistry and mapping that onto alterations in language can tell us a little bit about the neurochemical underpinnings of language. So there haven't been that many studies on psychedelics and language. There's only been a handful. So the first study was done by Amarel Cheek in 1965, where they measured predictability of speech under LSD, and I'll present you the study in a moment. In the 1970s, Natal and colleagues did a series of studies on patients undergoing psychoanalytical therapy using psychedelics, and their approach was very psychoanalytical, so their methods were very much grounded in psychoanalytical theory. And finally, in the 1990s, Spitzer and colleagues did a very important study looking at indirect semantic priming, and I'll spend a little bit of time explaining what they found, because this was really the inspiration for our current study. So I'm not going to talk about Natal and colleagues' studies just because the methodology that they use is not directly comparable to the methods that we use today in psycholinguistics. So Amarel Cheek had 10 patients from an alcoholic treatment center, and they had them undergo 4 experimental sessions. So at baseline, what they called at that time a low dose of LSD, so 100 micrograms, a high dose of LSD, 200 micrograms, and a follow-up session. And what they did was they sat the patient down in front of a mirror and gave them these instructions. I'm going to ask you to tell me something about yourself. I would like you to look in the mirror and for 5 minutes say aloud whatever comes to your mind. I don't care what you talk about, your appearance, what sort of person you are, how you get along with other people, how other people might think or feel about you, just so long as you talk about yourself. And they had 3 versions of these instructions. So this was one of them, and they also asked them to talk about a family member and also one of their peers in the therapy group. So this way they got a bunch of recordings, 5-minute recordings from these people in different drug conditions. They transcribed these and deleted every 5th word. So they had a text that looked something like this. So they made different copies of the text, many different copies, and they randomized this amongst hundreds of raters. And they asked these anonymous raters who were ignorant of the drug condition to fill in the blanks as fast as possible with what they thought the missing word was. And what they found was that not only did subjects speak less under the influence of LSD, but more importantly, they spoke in a less predictable manner. So the raters would be much less accurate at filling out what they thought the missing word was when the text came from somebody who was speaking under the influence of LSD, and more so in the higher doses. So this was an important study because it was the first study to be done on language and psychedelics. So moving on to Spitzer et al.'s very seminal study in 1996. So when I tell people that I'm working on language and psychedelics, there have been a few people that have referred me to this study. So they took 8 healthy participants. They did a placebo-controlled double-blind study with psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, very much related to LSD in both molecular structure and subjective effects. And they did a lexical decision task, which I'll present in the next slide. And they did this at 4 time points: before dosing, 50 minutes in, 150 minutes in, and 220 minutes into the session. So lexical decision task looks like this. So you see the participant in front of a screen. You have a fixation point so that their gaze is centered in the middle of the screen. You show one word, then a blank screen, very quickly, the next word. And their task is, so the second word stays on the screen until they respond as to whether or not the second word is actually a word in English. So some of the trials have just gibberish words as the gibberish letters as the second word. And what you find in normal circumstances, so not in the drug condition, is that related words are recognized faster than unrelated words. So you can recognize the word zebra coming after the word lion quicker than you would a word like table, which would be completely unrelated. And the reason why this happens is because you have a spread of activation in the semantic network. So you see the word lion, it activates the word lion, and in a split second, so within 100 milliseconds, you get a spread of activation to nearby words and concepts. So here you have the word zebra, giraffe, elephant, things that are related to lion are activated. So you're just that much more prepared to answer to the word zebra because it's already activated in your semantic network. And the spread of activation doesn't stop here. So it takes more time, but it also reaches more far out nodes in the network, but to a lesser degree. So you have a marginal amount of facilitation to recognize the word stripes, for example, because it's mediated by the word zebra, right? So you get lion, zebra, stripes. If stripes comes after lion, you're still a little bit faster at recognizing it relative to unrelated words. So what happens with psilocybin is that Spitzer et al. Had a bunch of different types of word pairs, and they looked specifically at indirectly related words, so namely lion and stripes. And what happens when people are under the influence of psilocybin is that they're faster at recognizing indirectly related words relative to placebo. So they're quicker at recognizing stripes when it comes after lion relative to when they're under placebo. And so one of the theories as to why this happens is because you again have your semantic network, you see lion, and the spread of activation just goes a little bit further within the same time limit. So you have a little bit more activation in the word stripes than you would in the placebo condition. So Spitzer et al. Concluded that psilocybin increases indirect semantic priming, And they claimed that psilocybin broadened conscious experience, and this was in line with some of the reports coming out of the 50s and 60s from the psychotherapeutic field, showing that psilocybin and other classical psychedelics like LSD and mescaline enhance free association in psychotherapeutic sessions. So Spitzer et al. Did this study at 4 time points. So they did at baseline and at 3 time points after dosage. And they found an enhancement of indirect semantic priming at this time point at 50 minutes into the session. And they claimed that this coincided with high levels of psilocin in the blood plasma. So psilocin is what psilocybin gets metabolized into after ingestion. But that leaves us wondering why we don't get an increase or an enhanced indirect semantic priming here, where psilocin levels seem to be just as high. Furthermore, they had to scale millisecond priming measures to percentage relative to baseline, and only then did they get a marginal enhancement in indirect semantic priming. And they don't report the crucial interaction for drug and time. So we can't unambiguously conclude that psilocybin actually enhances indirect semantic priming. So we set off to use a different task to test changes of semantic context effects between placebo and LSD. So again, LSD is very much related to psilocybin, except it has a longer half-life, so we don't have to worry so much about the timing of the task. And we used a picture naming task, which gives us reaction times, but it also gives us a nice corpus of errors that people produce when they're naming things. And in language production, as opposed to comprehension, where you're just recognizing words, so when you're actually producing words, naming items from the same semantic category takes longer and is more prone to errors than when you're naming things from disparate categories. And this is called the semantic context effect. So based on Spitzer et al.'s study on psilocybin, we hypothesized that for LSD, we would get an increase of errors from the same category. And this would signal a quicker and further semantic network activation. And the reason why this would happen, so here when you're trying to produce a word, you see a picture of a lion that activates the word lion and immediately activates the words that are around the word lion. So everything that's in the same category is activated, and all of these words are competing to be produced. So you're more likely, or you're likely to make a speech error, so you can say something like cheetah, oh, I mean lion. And that's why this happens, because you have an activated network of related concepts that are competing for being pronounced. So we had 10 participants who got placebo on day 1 and LSD on day 2 in a single blind manner. Our dosage varied from 40 micrograms to 82 micrograms. And we had our participants name pictures from 3 different categories: body parts, so things like hand, foot, neck; clothing, things like trousers, sock, shoe; vehicles, so things like cars, helicopters, airplane. And they had to name 32 pictures in a row 24 times, so it was quite repetitive. And it looked something like this. So they would see airplane, they would say airplane, they'd see hand next, they would say hand, then they'd see motorcycle, they'd say motorcycle, and so on. 32 times, 24 times. So the first thing we looked at was their reaction time. And when you're looking at naming, you look at speech latencies. And so that's how long it takes for somebody to start speaking as soon as they see a picture. And speech latencies can indicate processing ease or difficulty. So if somebody takes a long time to start talking, it can reflect some cognitive processing that they're having difficulty with. So you can measure this by detecting speech onset. So say at time 0, you see a picture of a hand. And sometime later, you look at the sound wave and you measure where exactly they begin speaking the word hand. So let's say this is around 250 milliseconds, which is relatively fast reaction time for naming. So what we found with reaction times is that speech latencies were not significantly different between placebo and LSD. And this suggests that maybe LSD just simply doesn't increase task difficulty. Now, we did another semantic manipulation that I'm not presenting here, where we looked at a much more fine-grained analysis of the reaction times relative to semantic condition. But the reason why I'm not presenting it is because we didn't find a difference between LSD and placebo. And while that doesn't tell us much about LSD, those findings actually are quite informative for current models that we have of speech production in psycholinguistics. So this is one of those cases where studying psychedelics can actually illuminate or inform some of the models that we currently have on cognition, on language specifically here. So turning to spontaneous speech errors, so we got a bunch of speech errors in our data. Errors can reflect a whole myriad of things. So Freud originally proposed that errors in speech reflect unconscious desires, conflict, train of thought, but in-come cognitive psychology in the 1970s, here Victoria Fromkin says that errors in speech production actually reflect underlying cognitive processes involved in speaking, and it can reveal units of representation involved in that process of choosing a word and pronouncing it. So we looked at the error patterns in our data, and we focused on errors in production that reflected problems with lexical retrieval. So we looked at filled pauses, where people would say things like leg for leg, hesitations, where people would say truck for truck, self-corrections, where they would say trow, shirt, and full lexical substitutions from the same category and full lexical substitutions from a different category. So we separated these two because full lexical substitutions from a different category were often due to visual similarity. So they would say hand for glove or foot for sock. And whereas full lexical substitutions from the same category reflected more of a semantic problem. So they would say foot for hand or something along those lines. So we tabulated these errors as a function of drug condition, and we saw that for filled pauses, hesitation, self-corrections, and even lexical substitutions from a different category, there weren't any significant differences in the LSD condition. But when we look at lexical substitutions from the same category, people under LSD were significantly more frequently making these mistakes. So what this tells us is that because our errors are highly constrained to full lexical substitutions from semantically similar items, this is consistent with the spread of activation under LSD, as we saw with Spitzer's study in the 90s. Due to our task constraints, so the fact that the people have to name, so they see a car and they have to name the word car, it only boosts nearby competitors, right? Nearby category competitors. So somebody is not going to say giraffe when they see car, but it doesn't rule out further semantic activation in the network. So one point to make about the errors is that we didn't get more self-correction. So you would expect people to catch their mistakes on the fly when they're starting to pronounce the wrong word. So we didn't see that people would do this more often in the LSD condition. So they wouldn't start saying something like trow and then fix their utterance and say shirt. And so we proposed that there is perhaps something going on with self-monitoring such that in the LSD condition, more mistakes are slipping by that stage of monitoring and being realized as full-fledged errors. And we do have anecdotal evidence from our participants who would report that their attention span would fluctuate quite wildly sometimes between blocks of items. And this is consistent with previous studies that have found that psilocybin, so another classical psychedelic, engenders deficits in attention. So here's some subjective reports we had. So one subject between two blocks of items said the perception of the body is somewhat magnified, and that can create challenges in focus or attention. And another participant said, I was actually having a little experiment of how much I can think of other things while doing the task. But this is actually not an uncommon report. I heard this from maybe 2 or 3 of the 10 people that we had in there, that they had 2 or 3 trains of thought going at the same time, which just goes to show that relative to placebo, they just didn't have that fine-tuned attention. But self-monitoring can't be the whole story here, because our reaction times are the same between LSD and placebo, and it doesn't account for our semantic effect. So the take-home message is that LSD does seem to affect the spread of semantic activation, as our error results have shown. And as a corollary, we also found that LSD affects self-monitoring such that you get full-fledged errors more commonly, and they're not self-corrected on the fly. And so extrapolating this to a more naturalistic setting, so if you're looking at spontaneous speech, you would expect a wider semantic associations, because you're not constrained to naming something that's just right in front of you. And so getting errors in your produced speech you can get a cascade effect from those errors that just pushes the semantic activation even further. And this could be potentially beneficial in a therapy setting, because free associations can feed off of this cascade of spread of activation. But it must be said that our study was quite small, so we only had 10 participants. It was only 2 more people than Spitzer's study. So if we really want to tease apart the confounds of attention and other things that might be happening here, it would be good to have a larger scale study using paradigms that don't require attention. So things like ERPs or other related tasks. So here, this is just a wink to some of the members of the audience who were subjects in this experiment. I'm sorry, I told you you'd never see these pictures again, and I'm sorry they couldn't be in Technicolor. I'm happy to take your questions.